Hello and welcome to our fourth quarter of the course. We're working on world regional geography, and today we are heading across the Pacific Ocean to East Asia. This week we're working on chapter 11 in the paid book. Where is it? Chapter 9 in the free book, chapter 10 in the free book, and the three iTunes podcasts if you want to do that later as well. So what we're going to be working on this week is focusing on Japan and China's outlying parts of China like Taiwan and Hong Kong. The Koreas are part of this session. And again, the Koreas, it's pretty much one country, but split into two political zones, North and South Korea. And then the influence, our reading this week and next week is about the South China Sea, which is China's sphere of influence that extends a couple hundred miles, maybe 1,000 miles south, all the way down to Singapore, which is a little outlandish, if you ask me, but they're the biggest boy in the block, so who knows? And that's a current event that is still going on. Hence, there's a whole bunch of articles and videos and stuff like that I've posted. So try and watch a couple of them. Make sure you read the ones I ask you to read, and then post your opinion and discussion starts on those. So let me share, first of all, the map so we could explain some of these things, what's going on, where these areas are. Okay, so I'll push this open. I'll start recording as we are. Okay, and we had a question before class that deals with this territory. So this is China's territory. This East Asia is China's sphere of influence, just like the Western Hemisphere under the Monroe Doctrine was the sphere of influence of the growing United States. And then, 100 years later, Teddy Roosevelt with his big stick. We were a little stronger back then, so we just finished the Spanish-American War. So we controlled the Caribbean Sea, sort of what China's trying to do with the South China Sea today. But in this region, we have China, which is the dominant player, 1.3 billion people. 1.3500, yeah. 1,300,000,000 so odd people. Let's just say that, which is about 4 times the size of the United States, which in regular layman's terms is when you go to the drive-in at In-N-Out, there's 3 more cars for every car you see. And that's pretty much what China's population would be. Does that make sense, Shabria? That everyone understands that one, right?
Yes.
The Chick-fil-A or the In-N-Out drive-in.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense, especially with all of their laws for how many children they should have.
And they should have 25.
Still that ginormous.
Yes, it's that big, and they still should have 25 more million people. Yeah. So China is the big dominant force here. And China is actually made up of, depending on who you ask, if you ask the Chinese Politburo or whatever they call it these days, I guess the Politburo was Russia, Soviet Union. If you ask the Chinese High Court, the people in charge, the communist or Communist Party, not really communists anymore since they're getting a whole bunch of money from capitalism. Macau and Hong Kong were these 2 international cities. These are cities that were left over from when the British and the Portuguese and other Europeans dominated. They won the Opium Wars, and they sort of dictated terms to China. Back in 1997, I think, or 99, somewhere in the last years of the 20th century, Hong Kong was given back to China officially. I think the QE2 left, and I think Prince Charles was in the boat waving away or something like that, under the conditions that Hong Kong would stay an autonomous region, which means they would have control of their own democracy, their own voting, and they would have no political outside influence from Beijing, which lasted about 10 years.
Okay.
The protests you're hearing the last couple of years, especially this past summer, are the students. Of course, students are the ones who don't have anything to lose. They don't have families or jobs to lose. So these are the people in every society that go out and protest against the man, right? The Hong Kong students and many others were protesting against the Chinese turning against that treaty that was signed and saying, this is now part of our country. We are going to make it part of China, and we're going to bring you into the rest of the country, and the rules that apply to them are now going to apply to you, which is not what was the agreement between the Brits and China was.
Okay.
Okay, so that's what was going on in China, still is. Democracy is being eliminated by the one-party system of Beijing. The other rogue state that China sees as part of themselves is the island of Formosa, now called Taiwan.
Okay.
And during the Chinese Revolution of the 1940s, right after World War II, they sort of pulled out of World War II because they started infighting between the nationalists, which was Chiang Kai-shek, and this revolutionary communist Mao Zedong. Spell that right, please. Good. Had a civil war for about 4 or 5 years, and Mao Zedong was the victor, and Chiang Kai-shek escaped across the Taiwan Strait to Formosa and declared Taiwan the official Chinese Republic. Okay, so in the UN, Taiwan still had the votes of China. And I think that disappeared within 5 or 10 years. But the Chinese state, the mainland, has always thought of Formosa as part of China. And Taiwan, which is the country that is now formerly Formosa, Taiwan is free, independent, democratic, although their biggest trade partner is right across the Taiwan Strait of China. It is an extremely advanced country. It is up there with South Korea as the most advanced technological country on the planet. It has, you know, engineers and democracy and stuff like that. And every so often, they have an idea of, we're going to vote for independence and officially declare ourselves separate from the People's Republic of China, i.e. the mainland. Of course, the PRC doesn't want that because it's still part of their own territory. It's like a civil war where they're saying, see you later, we're gone. Buy your country, we're starting our own country. And of course, Beijing doesn't want that. So they send, you know, military training exercises in the Taiwan Strait. They buzz Taiwan with a couple missiles every so often that overshoot on purpose, you know, just to intimidate Taiwan. The US, who is backing Taiwan because it's a democratic elected government, it's freedom, all that other stuff, plus it makes a whole bunch of money for us. And we have extremely good ties with Taiwan in terms of our colleges and universities and technology centers, especially in California, because, you know, we're just on the other side of that water body, that big water body, but that water body. So whenever Taiwan thinks about having an election to declare their freedom and democracy, China steps in and does all these military exercises. And the US comes in and sort of protects Taiwan with their own military exercises. And that's where we stand. It's been doing this for about 30 to 5, almost, now it's about 50 years, doing the same sort of chess match. But China is playing the long game. Their idea of revolution and change is like geology. It's a long-term game. Long-term game, yeah. So it's the same idea with the South China Sea that you're going to be reading about this week and next week. The idea that the South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, all of the carbon that is underneath the South China Sea is part of China because it was China's in the 14th century, because they have some map that has a dotted line saying this is all China. They're playing the long game, which means we're going to wait out this president, we're going to wait out that president, things will change, we're going to take it over eventually anyway. And that's sort of their plan with Taiwan also. We'll wait it out. We don't care if it takes 50 years, 100 years, we're going to be here. We've been here for 6,000 years. We're going to be here for another 6,000 years. So we're wait it out. And that's really what's the basis, the short version of the Taiwanese Chinese stress and political intrigue.
Okay.
But when you look at the numbers and the data, Taiwan is, especially down here, Southeast China's biggest trade partner. And of course, Southeast China is Taiwan's biggest trade partner. The federal government of Beijing set up these special economic zones where they could trade overseas with reduced taxes and advantageous trade agreements. And even without those, there was a lot of smuggling going on between Taiwan and China. So the people don't care. The people want to trade and make money and have their kids grow up to have a nice home and a nice family. But the governments, of course, don't want that to happen. They want their own power, right? It's a sort of the same thing we see with Korea. And I keep and I will keep saying Korea because it is one people, one nation of people. It's just split along political lines where one family is controlling the North and the democratic elected sections of South Korea are controlling the South. And we'll get to those two differences in a couple of minutes. So, and then all the way to the east here is this giant, sort of looks like a roller skate, which I draw on the board. It's not a roller skate, obviously. It's full of mountains. It's the country of Japan. You can't see it here?
Nope.
Is it off the screen?
I don't know. Maybe my view is not good.
Right there, Japan.
Maybe
Can you see my mouse move?
Hold on. Now I
Okay.
just. No, I can't see your whole screen. Like you're not sharing it.
I thought I was sharing the screen because I was over here on the left. Okay.
There you go.
There we go.
Thanks.
All right, you're welcome. So this is what I was talking about with Taiwan across the Taiwanese Strait being the biggest trade partners. It makes complete sense, whether it's free trade, legal trade, or black market under the cover of night trade. They're big trade partners here. Here are the Koreas, or Korea, split into two politically, North and South. They're the same people, same ideas. They've been split since 1950-ish. 1950 through 53 was the conflict, but they've been at war technically since 1950. And then all the way to the east, across the East Sea, or the Sea of Japan. Of course, the Koreans and Japanese don't like each other. Actually, not many East Asians like the country of Japan, especially the older generations, because of what they did during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. During World War II, which started in the 1930s, Japan invaded the Koreas in North China and the Philippines and Vietnam and all these areas. And they really were brutal and barbarian in terms of the female population, murders, stuff like that. They took slaves back to Japan. They had slaves here in North China and Korea. And after World War II finished, China, Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, they still do not accept Japan as an equal partner or an adversary. They still think of them as the torturous jerks from World War II. When I was in Vietnam with my friend in Central Vietnam, I heard through, through translations, a lot of animosity towards the Japanese. And when we saw Japanese tourists, they weren't treated very well. And for good reason, for good reason. Of course, those tourists weren't the ones torturing people 50 years before. Just like, well, I'm not going to go in that way, but
Yeah.
Let's stick with this topic here. So history has a long memory. Okay. So in 2002, the soccer world body called FIFA put together these 4-year tournaments called the World Cup, and they thought that Korea and Japan together hosting would bring them together again. It sort of did, but not really. Okay, they the signs all said Korea and Japan because it was alphabetical order, or Japan, Korea, but the ones in Korea said Korea first. The ones Japan said Japan first. It's just, and you can see how close they are. But Japan, through the imperial times, through World War II, were not the best neighbors for their neighborhood. And at the very north end of the Kuril Islands here, in the 3 days between when the US dropped the first nuclear weapon, the atomic bomb in Hiroshima on August 6th, and then Nagasaki on August 9th, the 3 days between those, Russia declared war on Japan, captured a couple islands, and then Japan sued for peace. So even to this day, there's Russian soldiers and Russian territory just to the east here, the Kuril Islands, that are still disputed. So also part of Japan are the islands to the south, Okinawa. I can't read that other one. These are tropical islands. We have military bases here. My daughter's best friend grew up in Okinawa and probably will go back in a couple of years because her dad's in the military still. And then Guam, which is a US territory, is somewhere down here, right off the map. And this was part of that island hopping strategy that we had in World War II to start getting closer to Japan to start bombing them. The islands would do that, make that easier. So this is the general layout of East Asia. And of course, we must not forget the buffer state, the state that was created between the Soviet Union and China. We call it Mongolia. There's Inner Mongolia, which is the country of Mongolia today, and Outer Mongolia, which is the buffered area in Russia and China, which is part of those two countries, not part of Mongolia. Mongolia, there's a great TV show, TV movie from maybe 10 years ago called Babies. I'm not sure if anyone's seen that. It's like, there's no dialogue whatsoever. It's babies being born and raised in Mongolia, Japan, San Francisco, and I think it was Kenya, East Africa. And it's a really great anthropological movie. It's a great geography movie. It shows you the differences between cultures raising 1-year-old baby boys and girls. It's really cool. It's funny. And the star of the show is the baby from Mongolia. They tie him up like a little cat so he doesn't crawl out of the house. He crawls up to this cow. He gets in this bucket. He's just all over the place. It's so funny.
Okay.
The kids are great. So look for that movie for extra credit. It's called Babies. And it's either on Amazon or Netflix or something like that. I've seen it again since in the theater, and that was really cool. So there's your overview of East Asia, the countries anyway. Some of the politics, some of the history, of course, that's just the broad brushstrokes here. Okay. So does that help you at all, Shabriya, with any questions you had before coming into class?
Yes. That's, I understand everybody in that area is very, um, don't call someone from a different country someone else because you will literally start a fight. Like,
Yes.
I mean, an all out brawl.
Yes, an all-out brawl. Absolutely. My friend who's Vietnamese, and this is a little out of the territory, but my friend who's Vietnamese, his family, his whole family calls him Filipino because he
Mm,
looks a little more Filipino. And he's not, he's totally Vietnamese, but it's the joke, it's the family joke. You know, you're not one of us, you look Filipino, you're completely different than us, you're, you know, and it's the same thing when you call like someone from Puerto Rico Mexican
yes.
or Cuban.
My
It's
ex-husband is Japanese, and
it's
yeah, and
yeah. Now
I
most of us don't do that on
Filipino friend.
purpose. Right? Most of us don't do that on purpose. We're trying to be nice, and but we don't know. But some cultures take it very offensively because I'm not Japanese, I'm Korean. You should know the difference, right? And it's offensive in some ways, especially if you call someone Japanese and they are Korean because they don't like Japan.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Shabria, you want to answer or fill in that gap? Your husband, your ex-husband?
He's Japanese and Italian. His father is his mother's full Japanese. And they were actually, his grandparents were in the sent to the camps here for what's that called? They were over here during
The
that
relocation camps.
the relocation camps.
Yeah, we'll call them relocation camps.
Yes, those.
Yes.
And I have been mistaken for being Filipino a lot. And going around with his family, people would say that I looked Filipino or that he looked Filipino because of the mix of, I guess, how he looked Italian from his father and that. And it was his grandparents almost fought because somebody said that, fought the person who was an older gentleman about it and started speaking in Japanese. And I had no idea what they were talking about.
No.
But don't go out to dinner and a Chinese restaurant.
Oh no. Yeah, you got to be careful, and some of that is the Japanese culture of exclusivity, of purebred Japanese. And I'm not trying to be racist or anything. I'm not trying to bring this up. It's just some cultures are like that.
His grandparents are very much like that. They didn't even talk to their daughter for 15 years because of the fact that she had married someone outside of the Japanese. But they live here. So,
Right. So it's a
but
little easier.
they still felt that she should only marry someone within her same race.
Right. And to be fair to the Japanese, it's not just Japanese people who do this. We see this in America all the time with whites or blacks or Asians or Native Americans. It's sort of this anthropological thing in the back of your mind that you want to stay with someone who's your own race. It makes sense in terms of knowing people and religion and food and customs.
Kind of like that Greek movie where she marries outside. And it's not that they dislike someone of that race or even treated me any different at that time.
Right.
But they just felt it was better because you knew the people better. You understood what they kind of their background more.
Right. And you all have similar backgrounds and history and viewpoints of the world that are somewhat similar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, there's 128 million people in Japan. There's 128 million different viewpoints of the earth and the world. Okay. But yes, the idea that the collective idea is still there. And that collective knowledge and collective culture is very hard to step over that line and bring somebody else into that culture and be accepted completely.
Yes.
And again, that's not just East Asian, this happens all over the planet. So excellent. Thanks for the elaboration of that, Sabria. That was really cool.
No problem.
Okay. All right. So the slides here, and I love this. I love starting with this picture here because it shows you the emptiness that much of China is, and especially Mongolia. Okay. These are the lights. So this is electricity and commerce. You can see Japan is lit up like a Christmas tree everywhere from Hiroshima, Nagasaki, all the way to the Kanto Plain in Tokyo, and then all the way up to Hokkaido. Okay. There's South Korea lit up again like a Christmas tree, and then there is North Korea with 2 dots only. One is the big city of Pyongyang, and then there's maybe 3 dots, 3 other ones, 3 smaller little military towns. You can see the coast of Taiwan. Again, the west side is more slanted towards it's lower in elevation, and it just goes right down to the sea, right across the strait to China. And you can see the Chinese population along the coast is huge. And the east side of Taiwan is more mountainous and it's more cliffs on the side. So generally it's sort of a tilted plain sort of towards China. Okay. You can see the big, gigantic megalopolis of the Pearl River estuary, which is Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Macau. A huge, huge portion of the manufacturing of the whole planet takes place right there. You can see the highways and the roads here in East China, which is flat and very wet and humid. The further north you get, the colder it is, obviously. But you can see the population is pretty much in the eastern half to 1/3 of the country. And then you have these mountains that sort of pop up here. And then you have pockets of areas that are populous. And then it gets to being really, really dry. Sort of like where we live, right? It's hot, hot, hot in the summer, and it's cold, cold, cold in the winter. But in here, the Tibetan Plateau, the Taklamakan Desert, the Mongolian, the Gobi Desert, this gets really, really cold at night and in winter time because you're far from an ocean that moderates the temperature. And you got this big, gigantic mountain range as well that blocks all the moisture from coming in.
Okay, I have a question about that then.
Sure.
So the area where the desert is now, just talking about Marco Polo and his expedition out into that area, he talked about it being more like of a grassland area, and that like how they originally had built the Great Wall of China out of grasses and stuff like that. Now, has that, like, how long ago did it start becoming desert?
Okay, great questions. So there are deserts here that are like the sandiest deserts you've ever seen. There are deserts like the Sahara Desert, which are rocks and sand. And there's deserts that are like the Mojave Desert where we live, where there's rocks, sands, bushes, and stuff like that.
Okay.
The Tibetan Plateau is a very, very high elevation. So the browns and purples here are above 17,000 feet and 11,000 feet. So you're talking really, really high elevation. So I think Marco Polo went to the north here, came through Kazakhstan to the north because there's a nice trade route through here. And then this is where the grasslands are. It looks like the high plains.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Still dry, but like the high plains. And then the Great Wall of China, one section's right outside of Beijing, but it stretches from west of Beijing, and you could actually follow the old wall all the way out to the desert here. Now, a lot of it is no longer there, but I was reading a book about roads and highways and Chinese roads and stuff, and I was following it on Google Earth, some of the trips they were taking,
Mhm.
and it's really, it looks like the Great Plains, it looks like a little bit of Arizona, and then the walls were dirt and grasses that sort of just separated areas, and the highways would go right through those old zones. It was really, really cool. So that's what's so cool about Google Earth. You could go on a tour and check them out. It's really kind of fun.
That's kind of, my family and I were starting to watch the From Above China on
Oh,
Disney
yeah.
Plus,
Mm-hmm.
and looking at that China, about the Great Wall of China and stuff, but we didn't actually get to finish it.
Yeah, those are really cool shows above this, above that. And let's head over to China here, and you can see what's just the mapping here. This is showing you grassland and low-lying sections. Let's go into the terrain here, and you're going to see these mountains start popping up. The southeast is sort of like the Appalachians, rolling hills. And again, it's nothing like where we live in California because it's much wetter and humid. But the further west you go, the mountains start popping up. Here's the Sichuan Basin, like the Sichuan Chinese spicy food comes from this zone because of
Okay.
the red soils.
Oh,
It's really cool. Yeah, it's actually a thing. If you look on a satellite picture, you could actually see this basin right there.
hmm.
Okay. So they call that the Sichuan Basin or the Red Basin because of the soils are really red, and it also has a lot of those spicy food. There's Sichuan right there. Okay. But as you go further west, you start hitting the mountains, the high Tibetan Plateau. You can see it's really barren with lakes everywhere from the glaciers.
Mhm.
Not many towns, obviously, because it's high and dry. And here's the Taklamakan Desert. I mean, that is all sand. Sand dunes, thousands and hundreds of miles of sand dunes. So all the roads go around that area because it's really difficult to cross. Then the river, the river right here is called the Huanghe, or the Yellow River, and it gets its name from the yellow loess or windblown soils of this area here. And where is the river? You could actually see the river. That's a river. I'm not sure if it's the river. Let's go back out to this map here. Yeah, it comes up this way. It does this giant loop all the way around, and it gets its name from this area here, which is the yellow basin, a lot of windblown soils from old glacial till, stuff like that. Look at the globe one. Okay. Whoa, it's all mixing. So here's the river coming this way. And again, it comes from the Tibetan Plateau area. But the highways, you can see the highways running through east to west. And of course, there are pretty much no highways here because it's all sand. Yeah, that's the Taklamakan Desert. I think we have a picture of oil companies trying to explore to try and find oil through here. There's one highway. There's another one. It's not really popular, obviously. But the big popular road is along the river valley that connects Western China and its more Muslim population with Eastern China, the Han and the Chinese that we all know of Chinese populations from. But the really cool thing is China is just like the United States, just like Russia, is an empire that's conquered people. It's moved, the United States moved west and eliminated Native Americans and conquered Native Americans and sucked up the Spanish settlers in New Mexico and then became part of the United States. And the Southern California population of Mexican and Chinese, the Texas populations of Mexicans and Spanish were all sucked up into the United States. China did the same sort of thing, as did Russia. It moved westward, and when you look at the ethnic populations, there are dozens of different tiny little ethnic zones throughout these mountains because it's isolated. And the further west you go, the more you are influenced by the five stands, the Central Asian republics. Stan means land of, so the land of the Kazakhs, the land of the Uzbeks, the land of the Afghans, the lands of the Pakis, the lands of the Tajiks, Kyrgyzstan, right? So all these territories, this is Muslim. These are a lot of Islamic people living here. And of course, that moves over the border because borders are just lines we draw. So the influence of Islam in the western section of China has gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years because the Han Chinese are treating them a little as inferior people because they're not Chinese, even though they are. Okay, it's like DC people calling, well, if you eliminate the California vote, then Trump won. Well, California is part of the United States. It just doesn't work that way. If you take away all the red states, then Biden won. If you take away all the blue states, then it doesn't work that way. We're one country, and so is the people who are living here. Okay, so does that help, or does that help explain some of the things you're asking me about?
Yes.
The deserts, the dry deserts. Okay, and you could follow these highways. It's really hard to see it on these maps here. You could follow these highways across China. Take that terrain off. There we go. Okay, and there are sections that will cross the old, what's it called? The old wall, the ancient wall from a long, long time ago. And it's really kind of cool to see them. But again, that's going down the Google Earth, Google Maps hole that you come out 4 in the morning going, what happened?
Yep.
So anyway, so hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're looking at here. And the first couple slides give you ideas and basically, where the physical geography is, where the big mountains are, things like that. This is fascinating. I love this. Okay. You could see this, right, Shabria? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So showing this slide, it tells you that the US and China are virtually the same size. And this is not including Alaska, not including the islands of Hawaii, but we're virtually the same country, same latitudes. Maybe they're a little warmer, like Guangzhou and Hong Kong. It's a little more. It's like being in Havana, maybe, right? And when you go to the Northeast, it's like being in Canada, right? Quebec and Montreal and really cold areas. Okay. So in the United States, the black outline, as you go west, it gets drier, just like it does in China. Okay. Now, remember, China has 4 times the amount of population as us, and we're spread out over this big continent. Of course, we have a big empty section here. There's people living there, but it's not as populous. Now, we have an ocean on the West Coast. Okay, we have 3 populous states, plus Arizona. You would include Arizona on the West Coast, even though it's nowhere near the ocean, because it's economically tied with us. And it's got the 5th largest city in the country, of Phoenix. So this is part of the West Coast. We have an ocean here. But Shabria, what's on the west side of China? Is there an ocean there?
No, mountains.
No. Mountains, deserts, big gigantic mountain passes, different people. That's not your country, right? So they don't go ocean to ocean like we do. So they don't have a West Coast. So the West Coast that we think of with all the people, throw that back east and then multiply it by 4. And that's what China is like. Okay, that's the East China section here. Again, it gets drier as you move west. When you move north, it gets colder, just like we have. But we have an ocean, they don't. They have this gigantic plateau that's 15 to 20,000 feet in elevation. We don't have that. But I like this because this shows you and gives you an idea of New York and Beijing, about the same type of climate, right? They're both near an ocean, right? Shanghai and Savannah and Miami, about the same thing, okay? Hong Kong and Guangzhou, somewhat similar. I mean, Houston and Guangzhou, somewhat similar. It's more like Havana, so it's a little warmer, okay? But this is basically the size of China, which is similar to the lower 48 states of the US. And again, when you see these ice castles and these big gigantic festivals of ice and cold, I think Montreal, I think freezing cold, because that's what it is.
Yes.
Right? That's what it is. So I love that map here. That's really cool. Here's your climate map, and it looks just like the US does, except again, we have a West Coast, they don't. So the further west you go, the drier and drier it gets because you're much further away from an ocean. Okay, that's a little bigger there. Okay, so this BWK, that would be the Arizona desert and the Mojave, and the BSK would be San Bernardino, Riverside, Victorville, maybe up to Owens Valley, dry but not extremely dry. Victorville, it would be more like the K, the WK, and the SK is a little warmer. Yeah, the SK gets a little more rain, just a tiny bit more rain. So this orange and yellow zone, think of that as the Mojave Desert. Okay, far from oceans, dry, cold at night, cold in the winter, except it gets really cold, really, really cold. Okay, so there you go. There's the US right there. So there's the BWK and the BWH, which is similar to what they have there. Again, the further north you go into Canada, the further south you go, more towards the Caribbean. Same idea. And this is for all my first graders out there, right? Okay, the big, and then dry and wet. Okay. So Japan is somewhat similar. Okay, Japan is a string of islands that pretty much go from Nova Scotia down to Havana, Cuba. It's got the same sort of environment as the US does on the East Coast. The variable climates, cold up north, hot, humid to the south, all sorts of treacherous geological problems. You have these fault these plate boundaries right off the coast. They all meet off the coast of Tokyo. All these red zones are tsunami danger zones, right? Tsunami activities. The red dots are volcanoes. Red dots are volcanoes. The black dots are major earthquakes. There's the Tohoku quake. There's 21 right there. The Tohoku quake of 2011 that caused the huge tsunami. And you can see it's much larger than any other quake that they had ever. Okay. There's an 8.5 in 1933. There's an 8.4 in 1891. There's a 9.0, which they've never seen before, in 2011. Excuse me. So going back to the picture of Japan, it's a mountain range. It's an island mountain range full of volcanoes. Okay. And where there are flat zones where we would normally farm, they fill them up with people. So the diluvial plains, lowlands, these plains, they call them, especially in the south facing the Pacific Ocean, they are filled with people. Right, the Tokyo area called the Kanto Plain, right there, K-N-T-O, K-A-N-T-O. That is the most populous zone on the planet, compacted with 45 million people, maybe more. Take all of California and throw it into 3 or 4 cities, and that's Tokyo. Okay. Korean Peninsula, same sort of idea. The south is just like China. The south is more open for farmland and a little wetter. The further north you go, you do have some pockets of lowlands, but it's a lot more mountainous to the north. And going back to our map, which is somewhere over here, you can see the difference. The dark green means there's forests. So the south has a lot more forests than the north, because the north usually cuts them up for wood and for fuel. And they use coal too. But you can see here all the cities, and I can't take this off here, I can't switch them. The cities are along the coast there. Obviously, that's where the trade is. Pyongyang is the biggest city there. And let's see if they actually have satellites that show us anything. Oh, not bad. Look at that. They stole the Arc de Triomphe from Paris and put it in Pyongyang. I'm sure the Parisians are a little bad about that one, but you know, no, they did not steal it. It's just a joke. Okay. But when I visited Vietnam, I flew into Seoul as a stopover, and it's the biggest city I've ever seen. I mean, this thing is huge. You're flying in and there's buildings everywhere, like everywhere. It's amazing. It's a huge ride to downtown. And then we went up on the mountain peak, the Seoul Tower, and you could really sort of see the whole city from up there too. It's really, really cool. But again, right over the side of the mountains, right there is North Korea. And there's about 800,000 troops with guns pointing towards South Korea, just over those mountains there. So it's pretty cool. Again, it's a huge, enormous city. I could not believe how big this thing was. And I grew up around New York City. And maybe it's because it's all one city together. There's not islands everywhere, but it was just hugely impressive. There's the top of the tower, and you can see there's the mountain ranges. It's pretty nice. But it was January and it was freezing cold because you are close to Siberia to the north. The cold winds from Siberia and Russia blow down and they make everything really cold. Really, really cold. And that's part of that ITCZ that we looked at with India and Africa, where in the summertime, the ITCZ comes up this way. Okay, it comes up over top and it sucks up the moisture from the hot oceans. So in the south, it's hot and humid and rains a lot. And in the wintertime, when the ITCZ shifts south, there's Singapore, so that's the equator. So the ITCZ shifts south, then it pulls all the air from the north down or southward, and that air is cold and dry. So if you've ever seen the TV show or the movie MASH, it's like a 1970s show, a long time ago. You know, I had a student whose dad used to watch it like religiously every single night, and he wasn't like a war guy, but he loved the show. But they showed the people freezing to death. I mean, it's really, really cold in the wintertime there. And that show, although it was about Vietnam at the time, but it was set in Korea, it showed you the brutality of the Korean winters. Yeah. So much, in fact, that if you look at your history books, one of the big battles in the Korean War was where we lost thousands of troops and most of them froze to death because it was so cold. So So those are the Koreas, and there's Japan in there. Physical environment stuff, all sorts of cool things in here. You know, it's a slideshow, and it's really cool because it covers a lot of the stuff here. The population's really interesting. As we talked about earlier, look, there's nobody, well, not nobody, but there's no California, there's no Oregon, there's no Washington, Arizona out here, right? There's no ocean. There are some people, and most of those people are from the 5 stands. Okay, so they're different than in the eastern section of China. But there's your Sichuan Basin, your red basin, the Sichuan Basin we looked at. And then again, throw all the people in the North China Plain. You can see how populous it is. The south is a little more mountainous, but then you get to the coastline, and that's where the people all live too. Okay, so a lot of cities, a lot of people. And then, of course, Tokyo is the largest city on the planet. Well, the largest urban area on the planet. Depending on where you draw borders and boundaries, Mexico City might be bigger. Sao Paulo's up there. But Tokyo is the largest urban zone on the planet. Okay. We looked at population pyramids before, or age sex diagrams, we call them now. Okay. You can see these both look like barrels, which tell you that it's a very developed country. And you do see a problem with Japan's population. What is that issue, Shibuya?
That I thought they weren't replacing.
Yep, they're not replacing people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And notice when you go to the older ages in Japan, notice these bars are still pretty fat compared to China, compared to the US. They have a larger population that's over 65 than most other countries in the world. So they last longer, they live longer, a little healthier. You could see the baby booms and then the baby booms kids. Right, there's the baby boom after World War II. There's the baby booms kids. But since then, the population has dwindled. Families, because it's so expensive, because most of the country is in an urban zone, families and couples are having one child, if a child at all. Right, 2 children is expensive. And 2.1 children is the replacement number that demographers look at to replace your population. So if you're only having 1 child, you're not replacing the parents, and your population is going to dwindle. And then this leads to a big issue with they call it forgot the name. It's the supporting population. It's the dependency population, where workers work and they pay taxes, and those taxes then go to fund schools, they go and fund nurseries, hospitals, and then older age homes and facilities for older adults, and then retirement wages, pensions, stuff like that. So if you don't have a large workforce, you can't afford to pay those commitments. So Japan is having a major issue. And their population is declining, and they don't have a workforce enough to fund the non-working populations of the older and the younger populations. Comment, Shibuya?
No. To me, it just seems as though they'll get workers to come in to do everything else, and that they'll pay people to take care of them when they get older, because they don't have children to do that.
Yeah, they don't have children to do that. Yep. Yep. And as we were going to see in China, part of that one child population that you might have heard of before, the reason you see a big difference between the number of males, and look at the males here, under 15, under 25, right, under 30. You can see the male lines are larger than the female lines. Like the females under 20 don't even hit 3 million, or I'm sorry, 3%. Where the males are almost all over 3. Okay, The 20 to 24, it's up to 3.75%. Down here, it's 3.4%. Okay, this is over 4.5. This is at 4.4. So you see a discrepancy between the males and females. And this is because of this long-standing tradition of when you have a marriage between a man and a woman, the woman will leave her family to go join the husband's family and live with the husband's parents and the husband's family. So if you're now allowed to have one child, you have a boy or a girl, the girl is going to leave you. And then there's no one to take care of the adults. So what families would do during this one child policy era from 1975 to 2015, and there have been adjustments, but what they would do, they would either starve the girl child, drowned the child like a kitten, you know, in the creek or something like that. They'd kill the child, or they'd forcibly abort the female child or embryo, which China made it illegal to do. And I think they were not allowing, like in the last 15 years, they were not allowing ultrasounds past a certain pregnancy date, so it wouldn't alert the parents of them having a girl or boy. So China recognized this problem. They called it female infanticide. You know what? Let me turn on the slideshow so you have actual words here. Okay. Is it there? Good. All right. So the difference between the males and the females account to cultural ideas of the female leaving to the male's family, and also female infanticide. Good. Killing of the infants. And this was done by, you know, drowning, starvation, lack of nutrients, lack of food, lack of water, or putting them in a I hate to think of it, putting in a bag.
We get it. We get it.
We get it, right?
We get it. Thanks.
So the government would also see, you know, if you had one child already, you were given stipends, like a carrot, right? You know, you lead the person with a carrot is better than the whip. So you give them incentives. So if you have one child, you have a nice, they would give you a nice apartment, a good school for that child, advantageous situations for that child to succeed. If you had a second child, that was all taken away. You might lose your job. You might lose your house, things like that. But looking at these numbers, and the demographers in China said, oh, we're in trouble here. We have to change this policy. So in the last 15 years, what they started doing was, if you had a boy child, if you had a girl child first, please don't kill it. You could try again in what, 2 or 3 years, spread them out to get a boy child. And that helped a little bit, but again, if you had 2 girls, then you couldn't try again. So this went on from 1975. Officially, it ended in January 1st, 2016. So 2015 it ended. But you could see here the legacy it's left. I think in one of my classes, we tallied this up with the raw numbers. And it was something like 35 million more men under 25 than females under 25. Whether it's 25 million, 35 million, it's a big number. That means that there's 25 million boys at the age of 18 who are horny and want a family, and there's no females around.
Nope. And most of the time, not a way to get to another female. Anywhere else.
Anywhere else. And this leads to importation of females, whether legally or illegally, into China for bride selling. And we see this in a lot of countries, especially around the Persian Gulf area. We see this in China. We see this in some Muslim countries, some Christian countries. We see this where females are kidnapped from somewhere else, human trafficking, and brought and sold as brides, because there's 25 million girls that are not there. They're disappeared, they're gone. So you're going to have these 20 to 30 million boys without a chance to have a family, and they were called the instead of having a family tree, they're called the family stump, because the family tree would just, there's nowhere to go. There's no, you know. So those extra boys without a family, you become a laborer. You become a someone who doesn't have a family structure. Maybe you have to leave the neighborhood to find jobs, and you become migrant workers. Or, as some people think, in the West especially, well, there's 20 million people for the army. Disposable people, no wives, no kids, put a gun in their hands and go start a war. 25 million of these men. So that's a little bit, you know, I wouldn't say out there. I mean, it is a possibility, but it's not the only reason they did that, obviously.
Did China allow adoptions and stuff for girls also?
Yes, that was a big thing. When we were looking to adopt, back when we didn't have kids and we were having, you know, reproduction issues, China had girls to adopt, because they kept telling that, you know, it was a one-child policy, and all of my friends who did adopt from China, they were all girls. You know, Baltimore, Minneapolis, Columbus, Ohio, New York City. The friends that we knew from Guatemala, they had second children and they adopted from China, which were all girls, which was telling the people in China, you know, if you don't want your girl, you know, please don't kill it. People will adopt that child. And that helped a little bit. But again, then you get the idea where you are selling your culture and selling your children somewhere else, which is still an issue. It's still an issue. So that's the basic one-child policy. A very broad stroke. I can go into this for hours because I studied a lot of this stuff, but that's the basics there. And Sabria, thanks so much for helping me walk through that, because it's not an easy subject, because you're talking about little kids.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I thought I wasn't going to get sad this time, but you know,
yeah,
maybe because we didn't do a lot over here, whereas it's all China's fault.
Yes, all China's fault.
I know, it's not just.
So here, this is a really cool population pyramid here. This is from the 2000s. I couldn't find one early, like, that was updated. And you can see here, this is from 2018. They're still publishing this. But this is different than what we just saw, because this one has the actual numbers themselves compared to percentages. And looking at this too, this would say, oh, look at the United States. Again, this is 20 years ago. Look at the United States, we're much larger than China, right? Look at our males. What happened to, this is 2000, right? So if someone was 85 years old in 2000, they were born in 1915. And 20 years later is 1935. At 22, 25 years old, you're now in World War II. So all those men went to fight the war. A lot of them didn't come back. Plus you get heart disease, which takes males disproportionately from females. And you see this big gigantic gap of no males that are over 80. But you could see the baby boom that we had after World War II. China's baby boom came after their revolution of 1960s or 1950s. And then again, we have the mirrors of the baby boom. But I would like you to look at these numbers at the bottom. Okay.
Much smaller.
Much smaller. So 10 million, which is the line here, is right here in China. So if you want to compare them, let's draw here. China is this big one, and the United States looks more like this. I don't know where that line came from, like that. I don't know where that line. So what you have here, you have China. China is dwarfing the United States. Okay, these 10 millions here, this that goes right over there only. So they have 40. They had in 2000 45 million girls, and we added 9 million girls. We added this up one time. The age under 20, they had the same amount of people under 20 as we had in the whole country.
Whoa.
Which was crazy to think about. But look, 50, that's 200 million right here, right? 50, that's 100 million, that's 400 million, which we had 300 million back in 2000. So when you look at these numbers, when you look at these things, please look at the numbers at the bottom, whether they are just percentages, or they're just straight numbers. So I don't know how to end the show. No, I don't want to keep it. Okay, back to the show. Okay, so there you go. Wanted to show you that one. I know it's 20 years old, but it still shows you the differences in looking at numbers, looking at graphs. Okay, there's China 2021. There's the populations. We looked at that one already. So, and then there's a bunch of slides with the one-child policy and stuff like that. Okay. All right, so I didn't want to go through slide by slide because I have that recorded already, but I wanted to show the ethnic group differences. Okay, remember China is an empire. It's conquered other people, and the Tibetan folks are the yellowish. That's Tibet. The Han Chinese are most of the population to the east. You can see Kazakhstan, Korea, the Uyghurs, never get that one right. I'm so sorry. For all those Uyghurs out there, I try every time and I get it wrong. The Uyghurs out here, and there's the Mongolians. Again, there's Outer Mongolia. You can see that in the ethnicity. And then this is where that wall was built, right through there. Okay. So languages, linguistic, ethnic diversity. So talking about languages, get that bigger map, it's not coming in, okay. You see the Sino-Tibetan, so Sino is East Asia, Tibetan is the Tibetan area. And you can see these languages are mostly confined to Asia proper. And then when you get off the islands, to the islands and the peninsulas, then you see the Korean, the Japanese, Thai, or Thai is a little different. It's not Thai, T-H-I, which is Thailand. It's something a little different. And there's Austronesian, which is tribal languages. Is where is that? Oh, that's the east side of Taipei, of Taiwan. But there's an ethnic map somewhere here. I have somewhere here showing you how diverse it really is. Oh, that's imperialism. Oh well. It was here. Maybe it's in my ethnic class. That's what it is. It's in my cultural class. So, but just showing you the differences in the diversity that we have in China. Those maps, the mountains really split up. the ethnic groups. And these are the major groups. So when you go into the details, there are so many isolated societies here because these mountains are huge. Okay, these mountains are the mountains that separate the biggest rivers in Southeast Asia. Okay, there's one set here. You can go from mountain range to mountain range to mountain range, and you go from the Salaween to the Mekong to the Red River to the Pearl River is this way. But then also you have the where's this one? That's the Huang. That's the Yangtze. The Yangtze River comes all the way in and is from this zone of Tibet also. So when you look at these maps and these rivers, you have major rivers all starting in the Tibetan Plateau, real close to each other. They all come through these major valleys right through here, one after another, and they go to Burma, Myanmar, Rangoon, they go to Bangkok, they go through Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, all the way to Ho Chi Minh City, and they go to the Red River in Hanoi. So these are major rivers that drain the Tibetan Plateau and all that rain they get. And we'll look at the Southeast Asia later and Mekong in a little bit. But the last place I want to show you all is the Pearl River Estuary. You know what, let me go to Google, and I hope I won't crash it this time. I went to Google Maps last night and my class crashed.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is going to take a little bit as you see my whole schedule. The economics of China and the last section, and we're focusing on China. I didn't really mean to do it that much, but it's, you know, it's the biggest country in the world, and it can be the most powerful place on the planet. Could be in the next century. A lot of economic folks and a lot of geographers are calling the 21st century East Asia's century. Okay, the 19th century was Europe, all focused on Europe. The 20th century was the United States. The 21st century is the Pacific Ocean. And that's why California, Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia, our ties to East Asia are going to keep our economy somewhat strong for the next 50 years, at least. Okay, so let's move in to the Pearl River Estuary. You can see the green is gone already. You can see it's all gray. Okay, an estuary is a zone where the ocean meets fresh water. And it's a briny, salty patch. And you can see the pictures here, all these little green zones, that's actually water still. So there's Macau, the big trading, gambling city that the Portuguese loved and had. Okay, right across the bay is Hong Kong. There's the yellow line that separates Hong Kong from mainland China. And the famous pictures of Hong Kong are through here and through here. Okay, the old airport, where's the old airport? It was like right over top of like the city. So you'd fly in and you almost hit houses. I think the new airport's all the way out here, way far away from everybody else, which is nice. But you can see everywhere it's flat, it's built up. And everywhere it's not, it's all mountainous. Okay, let's do it this way. So you can see a little better that way. Is that better? There we go.
Definitely.
Okay, definitely better. So Hong Kong is a term called the fragrant harbor. Supposedly it smelled nice when they first landed there or whatever it was. But you can see it's split up between water. It's a big, gigantic port. And it was the entrepot. Entrepot is ENTREPO. Entrepot. O-T. Put a T at the end. It's French. Entrepot or something like that. If you look up entrepot, whatever it is, it's like the gateway, the trading gateway to the rest of the world. Entrepot. There's an E in there. So a port city or other center to which goods are brought for import and export and for collection and distribution. So there you go. There's a hat. I knew there was a hat on it somewhere. Entrepot. Entrepot is how you pronounce it. Okay. So this city, just like Singapore is an entrepot. This one was the illegal way to get into China for so long. You trade with Hong Kong, and then in the middle of the night, these trucks would drive across the border, go here to the Chinese border, cross over into China, and you could see these big, gigantic lines. Wow, there's no trucks there today. I've seen pictures, these are huge. You cross into China, then you switch back to the left side or the right side. I think China's driving on the right. Hong Kong, since it was British, drives on the left.
When do they stop sending stuff? Is it January, February then?
When they stop sending stuff?
Yeah, China, and then we have like 2 months where we don't receive shipments from China.
I don't remember that one. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I just know from being in retail and expecting stuff retail wise, they shut down their shipments, and we have no shipments for places like clothing stores, Targets, Walmarts, all the big box stores don't get any shipments between that whole time. We have to live off of what's in our warehouses.
My guess it's around Tet or the Asian New Year. I keep saying Tet because my friend's Vietnamese, that's what I grew up with. But the Asian New Year, which is the Lunar New Year in late January, early February, where it's the largest movement of people on the planet because people will go back to your hometown and bring gifts galore, factories closed down, because a lot of the folks who left these interior towns are illegal because you're supposed to register wherever you go. Now that's changed a little bit, but people would leave the interior countryside where there wasn't many jobs. They go to Shenzhen, they go to Guangzhou or Guangdong. They work in the factories, and then the factories would close for Lunar New Year.
Okay.
So then people would go back to go see mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, all the aunts, bring all the little nephews and nieces presents, be there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then come back. So maybe that's when the factories would shut down.
Okay.
That's my best guess.
I was just wondering maybe that was tied to it, but it's not yet.
Yeah.
So never mind.
No, that's good. I think that would be the best answer, the Lunar New Year.
Okay.
So what I love about Google Earth is right now, this is called Shenzhen, the city of Shenzhen. Let me put place category in there. We have towns. Okay. So Shenzhen is the name of the city here. And when I first started teaching in 1997, this was a town of 5,000 people. Today, it's over 5 million people.
Wow.
My friend, who is in the back, not this picture, but my friend Steve, who passed away, he's from Hong Kong. His wife was from China, Amy. They lived in Gastonia with us. We had dinner all the time. His job was he was Hong Kong, so we had a Hong Kong passport, a British passport, and a Chinese passport.
Wow.
So he was allowed to go into China because he worked for all these factories, and he'd look at the factories, make sure the shipments were going well, and back to the US and all over the world. And he was amazed at the growth. He would sit there as a kid, go to these mountains and look at China and just wonder, I can't cross that border, but that's what China's like. And it was all mountains and green. By the time he passed away in the early 2010s, he said that it was all factories. where he used to go and see miles of hills and mountains, it was filled with all these factories, all these houses, all these people. He couldn't believe the change in just his lifetime.
I bet.
Yeah. So the city of Shenzhen, which is this little tiny city, now it's huge. Guangzhou, which is the big gigantic city. Here, let's go back in time. So I love Google Earth here. So you can go back to 1977 and you can see the differences.
The water's blue there.
Yeah, the water's blue. Look at that. Terrible satellites, but yeah. So let's go from 79 to 84. And again, you're starting to see a lot of the greenery being taken away. Okay. It's not the best, obviously. Let me take the buildings off. That'll help. And the terrain, maybe. Okay. So this is 1984, 1990. You're starting to see more and more people. You still see a lot of green here. Look at all this farm still there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. 1996. Farms are disappearing. 2002. It's building up more and more and more. 2008. Most of those farms are now gone. And it's city as far as you could see. 2012. Just had a whole bunch of rain, you could tell. And then 2016 is the last one. What is 2016 is the last one they have. That's really weird. Yeah, so 2017 is the last picture they have. So it's huge. This is now a ginormous city. Absolutely huge. So when you go to Wikipedia and you click on Guangzhou, the former Canton, again, when this was British, they called it Canton. So the second biggest urban area in the world, some estimates 24 million people stuck in there. The government officials said the population was 10.3 million, and that was adding 152,000 people every year. Now you can go into this and look further and further, but it's amazing the differences. Shenzhen. There's the full article there, but it'll pull up. So this part of the world has changed tremendously over the last 20 to 30 years. It's absolutely unbelievable the amount of people are there. So it says, look at that. It's dubbed China's Silicon Valley, the fastest growing cities in the world, one of the fastest from the 1990s through the 2000s. It has officially almost 13 million people in 2017, but police and authorities estimate over 20 million. Again, a lot of those illegal workers coming from the interior of the country, because this is where the jobs are. Because there are no jobs in your small town 400 miles in the interior, but this is where the jobs are. So people would come here illegally to work, to send money home, just like we see people coming to the United States to work and send money home. So this is the Pearl River Estuary. It is the factory of the planet. When you see things made in China, it would be about 75% from this zone right here, from the Pearl River Estuary. Now, Shanghai is a big city. Shanghai is a huge city at the end of the Yangtze River. It's right over here. For a long time, this was the giant city where East meets West. China would meet the rest of the world here. You had a lot of business people from the outside coming to Shanghai because Shanghai has this gigantic river. The port is amazing. Where's there it is. This is called the Pudong, and the slides it shows you, it's like 25 miles long. And there's ports all along that river, all through the heart of Shanghai.
Our sailors from San Francisco used to get
Mhm.
shanghaied there.
Shanghai there, that's right. There's that term. That's right. And my father-in-law, who's now 93, during World War II, he was sent to Japan to disarm the Japanese. His, yeah, and same thing with the Korean War. Korean War is a little different, but their R&R, the rest and relaxation, was going to Shanghai. Paul would talk about Shanghai all the time. So that is, and you can see here, it is the mouth of one of the biggest rivers on the planet. You can see all the sediment coming in. It's a wonderful harbor, and it is the largest city, or was the largest city in China. Again, we just looked at Shenzhen and Guangzhou. Could be bigger, but I still think Shanghai is still the biggest city in the country. Yeah, so I can't see the numbers there. 7 million. This is ridership, averages 3.5 million a year, 7 million, and it goes up from there. But it's a huge city, second largest. It is the largest city. There you go. Rapid transit, the largest city in the country.
Don't they just push people into the metro and just stuff them in?
Yeah, that's what they do in
There?
Tokyo. They do that in
Okay.
Tokyo.
That's Tokyo. All
Yeah,
right.
it's Tokyo. Yeah, there. My
It scares me.
when I was in grad school, my college girlfriend, she used to teach, and she taught in Japan for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
She was a blonde girl from Iowa, about my height, so not very tall, but she would stand a full half head above everyone in the subway,
Yeah.
and she was the blonde girl. So I was like, oh, cool. She would say, yeah, people's job was to push people into the subway car when the door shut. That was their job. So you could see here, the flat zone is filled with people. This is 35, 40 million people in this region of Tokyo. Big cities are Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kawasaki. So the tires, the motorcycles, that's where they come from. And this is the largest urban zone on the planet. And of course, you were right next to this big giant fault line off the coast right there. There it is, the trench right there. And then there's another trench right here. It meets right off the coast of Tokyo, where they're expecting another huge earthquake soon. Yeah. So there you go. And you can see all the low-lying sections are filled with people in Japan. Okay, the former capital of Kyoto is somewhere over here, and they moved it in the 1850s to Tokyo Bay to have better access to the outside world, and it worked. So now you have Tokyo as one of the 3 big financial centers on the planet. We call them Alpha Plus cities. Do you know what the other 2 might be, Shabria? Economic, banking cities?
I
One's
don't.
in the United States and one is in Europe.
Okay, so in New York.
New York.
And
Where's the other, the market, you have the Tokyo Nikkei Index, you have the New York Stock Exchange, and you have the other one
I don't know.
It's England, it's London.
Okay. London.
Because London, remember, London was the capital of the British Empire.
Gotcha.
So that's why it's so connected throughout the world. So London, Tokyo, New York, the 3 big A+ cities that are economically powerful. And the World Trade Center attacks in 2001 sent economic ripples throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
A huge earthquake and tsunami in Tokyo and Tokyo Bay will cripple some of the economies around the planet as well. But you can see here, there's the subduction zone right off the coast of southern Japan. Here's the Pacific Ocean subduction zone. There's Guam right there, and they all meet right at Tokyo. The last big gigantic earthquake was 1923, where 45,000 people died, and most of them were refugees that went to a park, and then the firestorm engulfed the park. Like we see San Francisco. San Francisco lost most of their buildings because of the fire. Same thing with Tokyo. So when you zoom into Tokyo, the downtown area of Tokyo is really, really cool, really gorgeous. And then you have thousands of miles of these small little tiny streets, no particular patterns whatsoever. Really, really difficult for fire engines to get to. So it will burn like there's no tomorrow. Our sister city down the hill in Redlands and San Bernardino, we both have sister cities that are based right outside of the Tokyo area. I think, was it Hino, Hino, is the sister city for Redlands. There's Hino right there. And Tokyo will be hosting the Summer Olympics in 2021 if things get back on track with the rest of the world. We hope. So there is our tour of East Asia. I hope that you learned some things and had questions. You could ask me anytime you need to. Go ahead and use the discussion board, or the discussion board would be perfect for that. Okay, here's your internet assignment number 4. Notice there's a whole bunch of these. Okay, I don't expect you to read all of them, and there's more at the bottom here. You don't have to read all of these, but a lot of them are small, little, like 3-paragraph things with a lot of pictures. So please look at these. There's a couple of videos. Oh, these are all PDFs. And it's going to give you an idea of what's going on in the South China Sea. So we'll talk more about that next week when we head down the coast to Southeast Asia. All right. Well, thanks everybody for showing up this week. I appreciate it, and good luck. We'll see you next Tuesday, right? Tuesday, back to normal schedule Tuesday. Yeah. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.